48 hours before silence. The ceasefire that nearly shattered the world.
At 2:15 a.m., Khan Yunis trembles as an MQ-9 Reaper sweeps low across the valley, its Hellfire missile tearing through corrugated roofs before the blast folds the air into silence. CENTCOM locks coordinates, and flares bloom above the ridge like ghostly suns. Off the Mediterranean coast, a destroyer unleashes tomahawks that carve arcs of fire across the sea. On the ground, civilians surge into shelters, lights flicker as an Israeli officer whispers a trembling ceasefire command. In Washington, the Pentagon glows red with maps of Gaza, every heartbeat synchronized with the next decision. At 4:15 a.m., over Beit Hanun, a kamikaze switchblade dives into an armory, metal screams, and the blast ripples through buried corridors. From the east, HIMARS rockets streak low, crushing brick walls and clouding the streets in brown haze. Above Rafah, an EA-18G Growler jams enemy radar, erasing all frequencies as high-pitched waves hum across the sand. In the IDF command bunker, a young soldier bites his lip, sweat tracing his headset while moving targets flicker on the screen. Minutes later, B-52 bombers release JDAMs along Salah al-Din Road. Each explosion rolls like thunder trapped beneath stone skies. At 4:40 a.m., anti-air batteries at Nusayrat roar to life, shells bursting mid-air and raining shards like molten rain. Beneath the sea, a Virginia-class submarine launches cruise missiles that slice through the dawn horizon toward Gaza. From 18,000 meters above, a global hawk scans the heat signatures below, its operator scribbling notes without blinking. Artillery units pull back to open ground. Smoke thickens, engines hum, and the earth still trembles under spent echoes. In Washington, at 5:08, the Defense Secretary signs an emergency order to preserve the ceasefire. The casualty counter keeps rising on every screen. At 5:10 a.m., a Bayraktar TB 2 circles above Deir al-Balah, its thermal rounds collapsing a hidden command post in a burst of rising smoke. In a frontline clinic, a doctor tightens his mask as lights flicker and distant blasts rumble beneath the floor. Electronic warfare teams jam Hamas frequencies, turning command screens to static. By 5:22, Israeli scouts reach Shujaya. Radios whisper, "Hold the line, do not fire first." Their heartbeats echo deeper than the tunnels below. At the Rafah coast, a B-1B Lancer skims the waves, its bombs tearing through concrete layers as echoes dissolve into sea spray. By 5:30, HIMARS launches another volley toward Jabalia. Windows implode, steel frames twist, and dust turns daylight brown. Inside a US UAV control room, an operator's fingers blur across the console, updating coordinates by the second. A Shahed drone skims low, plunging into a power substation. The district goes dark in a single thunderclap. Along Salah al-Din Road, Israeli infantry dig in, mortars roaring in succession as their map blazes red grid by grid, a living pulse of war. At 5:40 a.m., the Iron Dome intercepts a storm of rockets, each detonation cracking the night like whips of molten steel. Above Zaytun, GOI satellites stream live images. Fires bloom across the grid as US analysts nod in silent confirmation. In a hidden shelter, a child clutches a backpack, eyes wide under the red glow of an emergency lamp. Near an old tunnel, mobile artillery locks position and fires. The blast lifts dry leaves into the air like ash. At the southern command post, alarms blare, UAV team offline, screens blur, and every antenna turns instinctively toward Gaza's burning horizon. At 6 a.m., B-52 bombers rain cluster munitions along the border. Earth splits open, steel fences twist under the shockwave. Inside the UN Coordination Center, advisors freeze as satellite feeds flash. 20 simultaneous blasts. A foreign journalist runs through Khan Yunis, camera trembling, recording only fragments of thunder and dust. Minutes later, a gray eagle circles above the missile corridor, laser marking a final strike. Fire slices through the haze. In a field tent, a Palestinian nurse tightens blood-stained gauze. Every heartbeat aligns with the distant rhythm of falling bombs. At 6:25 a.m., Patriot missiles launch from a US base, streaking upward as the ground trembles beneath mirrored glass. Over the sea, A KC-135 tanker links with a B-1B, engines humming against the dawn wind. Across central Gaza, an Elbit Hermes 900 glides low, its sensors scanning for fading heat. A sudden mortar barrage erupts, concrete shatters, alarms wail, and dust turns the streets blind gray. At 6:40, self-propelled CENTCOM guns answer back from the border, their shells tearing the sky apart until the map itself disappears beneath smoke. At the southern UAV post, a female officer watches the radar tremble beneath her fingertips, breath fogging her mask as static hums through the console. On Qassam Street, a command vehicle erupts under a drone strike. Shards of steel pierce nearby walls, silencing all comms. By 7, an EA-18G floods the air with electronic interference, muting every VHF signal as a dark silhouette moves across the monitor. Underground, civilians sit motionless, hearing the earth groan like a buried machine. From Tel Al-Hawa, a recon drone spots a launcher, and the image cuts to black mid-transmission. At 7:15 a.m., a B-52 banks sharply, releasing GBU-31 bombs that tear through Al Zaytun, dust twisting upward like a gray cyclone. Inside CENTCOM, a colonel points to new coordinates. Red dots multiplying across a live map as pulse rates climb in sync. Along Jabalia's ruins, rockets collapse hidden posts, light flaring behind shattered walls. By 7:50, a Phoenix Ghost drone pierces an ammo depot. The blast folds the roof into molten iron. In the Pentagon's emergency chamber, generals sign the order to halt escalation, then stare in silence as dawn bleeds through the windows. At 7:55 a.m., 3 kamikaze drones skim the ground, striking Hamas communication posts in western Rafah. In a U.S. drone command room, a young lieutenant weeps quietly after pressing the final launch key, red lights flickering across his face. By 8:03, HIMARS rockets arc eastward, crushing concrete within a heartbeat, dust ricocheting off bunker walls. Above Khan Yunis, MQ-9 Reapers sweep in formation, Hellfire missiles carving light into the low clouds. At the IDF command hub, a voice shouts, "Don't lose the southern ring." Maps print endlessly beneath strobing lights. At 8:10 a.m., Israeli artillery pounds Jabalia, the ground sinking under chain detonations. Inside an armored vehicle, Marines grip comm lines as warning lights flicker amber. By 8:20, M270 launchers roar, 9 trails carving the sky. Concrete collapses, windows explode outward, and the air thickens with dust and flame. At 8:25 a.m., an Elbit Sky Striker drills through a reinforced bunker, walls erupt, the blast lifting steel doors from their hinges. A war correspondent snaps photos through a shattered window, the next explosion shaking his lens to blur. By 8:30, a B-1B drops precision. GBU-38 bombs on a buried radar station. Ground splits, heat rolls upward in waves. Moments later, the central power grid ignites, black smoke twisting like a broken siren. Inside the UN command hall, an advisor rises in shock as red perimeters swallow civilian zones. The stench of gunpowder seeps through every map. At 8:40 a.m., enemy jammers disrupt U.S. drone signals. Screens flicker black before a technician slams the console in frustration. Seconds later, an EA-18G reignites counterjamming mode, slicing Hamas frequencies into static. Along Gaza's shore, U.S. Marines advance in landing craft, engines blending with the distant roar of bombs. By 8:50, a Sky Guardian drone spots a
Target
moving
confirmed.
convoy,
Weapon
relaying
release
coordinates
authorized.
back to the Navy radar. Moments later, HIMARS fires its final volley from the south. Targets erupt in white smoke as the battlefield grid begins to fade red. At 8:55 a.m., an M2 Bradley smashes through concrete barriers, its 25mm cannon rattling the air with short bursts. In the forward command post, an Israeli officer removes his armor, eyes locked on the flickering thermal feed. By 9, satellites capture 3 expanding fire zones, shockwaves layering like echoes from the Earth's core. Above, a gray eagle circles low, releasing a hellfire into an underground tower. The explosion swallows the last transmission. At 9:05 a.m., a Switchblade drone slams into an ammunition truck, fire coils upward, asphalt torn like burning cloth. In the logistics hub, a young Israeli officer studies a paper map under flickering light, sweat staining the edges. By 9:10, 155mm artillery rains down Beit Lahia, shockwaves splitting concrete, steel doors shuddering in their frames. Above, EA-18G Growlers slice through the haze, their high-pitched interference buzzing in pilots' ears. At Gaza's center, smoke towers 200 meters high, shadows falling over a hospital as glass bursts in rhythmic waves. At 9:20 a.m., 6 kamikaze drones strike in perfect sync, concrete cracking as shockwaves ripple beneath the city. In an old bunker, civilians sit in silence, light flickering through vents like a dying heartbeat. Offshore, the USS Carney receives new coordinates. Its radar sweeps for 7 seconds before launching Tomahawks into the horizon. By 9:33, explosions bloom across the logistics zone, cameras shuddering into static. Inside a US electronic warfare post, a lieutenant restores satellite links. The map glows red again, pulsing with renewed command. At 9:45 a.m., B-52 bombers cut through the clouds, releasing streams of GBU-39A bombs, waves of pressure flattening the skyline into ash. In a field hospital, Palestinian nurses drag stretchers beneath a collapsed ceiling, their eyes unable to tell day from night. Along Salah al-Din Road, M109 howitzers thunder, dust swirling like storm tides. At 10:05, a kamikaze drone strikes a mobile rocket hub. Light engulfs the compound in a single white flash. Inside the Pentagon, commanders rise as Gaza glows red on the map. One voice orders, shift to control phase. At 11:02 a.m., rockets arc from Gaza toward Beit Hanaun. Sirens wail as Iron Dome interceptors streak upward, detonating mid-air. In a civilian shelter, people huddle against the walls, lights dying twice before the silence settles. By 11:05, an MQ-9 Reaper tracks the launch site, laser locking before a Hellfire dives, Earth folds over the blast. At Tel Aviv's command center, red points bloom on live maps. The chief orders a full encirclement of Sector F-12. Moments later, Israeli commandos descend from Blackhawks, storming rooftops as the city swallows the sound of war. Artillery pounds rooftops. 155mm shells bursting low and sealing tunnel mouths in rolling smoke. In a drone station, an American soldier tracks silhouettes through thermal haze before sending the strike command. By 11:15, a kamikaze drone smashes into a bunker, twisting metal beams like wet wire. On a ruined rooftop, Israeli troops uncover hidden weapons as debris rains down. At the Pentagon, strategists finalize the order, secure the southern corridor. All eyes fix on Gaza's live feed, where the urban war has only just begun. At 11:30 a.m., U.S. infantry advance through Zaytun's narrow alleys, robots clearing the way as metal taps echo against stone. In an abandoned basement, a mini drone hovers near the ceiling, detecting faint body heat before transmitting data upward. A grenade launcher flashes from a shattered window, the shockwave hammering riot shields as alarms strobe red. Command posts order blocks 7 through 9 sealed, troops flooding side passages. Over Rafah, a Bayraktar TB 2 tracks hidden tunnels, its engine whining once before disappearing into the smoke. At 12 p.m., CAESAR howitzers unleash suppression fire across Khan Yunis, glass shattering as the ground cracks like dry bone. In a dim field ward, a Palestinian nurse steadies an IV while distant explosions rattle the lights. Minutes later, a Shahed 136 drone crashes into an armored convoy, fire spiraling through the narrow street. At the U.S. Drone Center, monitors black out for 4 seconds before the satellite link reignites in red. East of Gaza, Israeli paratroopers breach an abandoned factory, uncovering a map of tunnels burned around the edges. At 12:38 p.m., Washington analysts watch red markers shift on the F-10 corridor. Someone whispers, they're retreating underground. A kamikaze drone plunges into a tunnel exit, white smoke coiling beneath the bricks. Deep in a bunker, ground radar trembles as a commander nods, targets alive. By 1 p.m., HIMARS rockets rake Salah al-Din Road. collapsing rooftops and chimney lines. No direction left is safe. At 1:05 p.m., M270 launchers rain rockets over District 4, flames folding steel doors inward as the streets convulse. On a rooftop checkpoint, an Israeli officer signals orders by hand, dust swirling around a blood-stained bandage. Moments later, a Hamas drone slams into a U.S. recon vehicle, shattering the windshield in a burst of red light. Inside the UAV control room, a technician presses his ear to the partition, listening to explosions echo through the walls. At 1:15, a Talon robot halts mid-alley, one short beep, then silence. At 1:20 p.m., HIMARS fires its final salvo of the hour, rockets slamming near the eastern rail yard, tin roofs flip, bolts hiss into burning trees. Beneath collapsed homes, survivors crawl through dust, gasping between distant detonations. 5 minutes later, an MQ-9 Reaper circles a fuel depot, laser locking before a hellfire pierces the center tank. Flames tower like a column of gas. On an offshore carrier, an F/A-18 pilot grips the throttle, visor reflecting the rising blaze. By 1:30, Khan Yunis quakes. Front line and rear have become the same. At the UN office, humanitarian advisors study live fire maps, red zones spreading across civilian blocks. One nods quietly, no one speaks. By 1:35 p.m., a Heron TP drone scans from the north, tracing movement beneath scorched rooftops before diving for pursuit. In a ground operations tent, U.S. troops ready CQB rifles, boots echoing through gray concrete corridors. Moments later, a cruise missile from a U.S. destroyer strikes a Hamas broadcast tower. Its antenna snaps mid-air. Nearby, a nurse collapses beside her patient, the IV still clutched in her hand. At 2 p.m., rocket barrages hammer Street 12, rooftops exploding as debris rains through the air like shattered bone. In an exposed trench, an Israeli soldier's finger trembles on a detonator wire, pulse racing beneath the drone's distant hum. By 2:05, a kamikaze UAV slams into a supply truck, flames leap 3 stories high. A Spider recon robot triggers an unseen mine, its camera flashing white before fading to static. Inside CENTCOM, an officer's voice turns cold. Erase grid D15. The map goes silent. One more coordinate disappears. At 2:15 p.m., HIMARS rockets blanket the retreat path, detonations shattering pavement and nearby walls. A Hamas gate decoy appears on infrared. M109 howitzers fire 3 rapid rounds, splitting the ground into a blackened X. At a damaged checkpoint, U.S. soldiers pause beside cracked walls, rifles steady as echoes roll closer. At 2:30 p.m., a Sky Guardian drone circles Rafah's market, pinpointing a heat trace beneath torn canvas before the missile dives through. Inside Gaza's power station, monitors blink once, then fade to black as workers crouch beneath splintered desks. Minutes later, a Hamas drone strikes a defensive wall, flinging U.S. troops backward into the haze. In an Israeli command tent, maps twist under red light as officers press trembling fingers over retreat lines. By 2:40, a switchblade rips through a supply tent, fire blossoms through the canvas like tearing silk. At 2:50 p.m., EA-18G Growlers resume electronic warfare, flooding Hamas frequencies with static until every VHF channel goes dead. Inside a stone bunker, an American advisor reports sectors D-14 and E-22 neutralized. By 2:55, artillery shells rip through a new assembly point, debris spiraling across blackened walls. On a border ridge, radar picks up a lone inbound drone. Soldiers ready improvised launchers under gray skies. At 3, anti-air rounds burst prematurely, dark sparks raining down like silent fireworks over shattered rooftops. At 3:05 p.m., Global Hawk surveillance maps 9 hidden heat zones. Commands follow instantly to concentrate fire. Moments later, Tomahawks strike a Hamas rocket depot, setting off secondary blasts that stain the western sky crimson. Inside the Pentagon's monitoring hub, white static flashes across the screen. An advisor exhales, cut 3 communication lines. At 3:15, M777 howitzers fire 4 bunker busters. Cracks split the ground as sunlight pierces through fractured stone. At 3:20 p.m., an Elbit Hermes 450 scans the water plant, its feed encrypting a frame of shadowed movement before vanishing into code. In a relief tent, a Palestinian medic stitches wounds barehanded, explosions pulsing outside like a heartbeat. Moments later, a young U.S. technician whispers, "Grid D-35 just went dark again." By 3:30, an AH-64 Apache strafes Deir al-Balah. 30mm rounds tear walls apart, smoke folding into the fading sky. At 3:40 p.m., a Phoenix Ghost drone plunges into a 6-story block. Stairs collapse, cables spark as smoke climbs toward the clouds. Inside a field tent, a logistics officer removes his gloves, calling casualty codes in a steady, exhausted voice. Offshore, U.S. warships activate close-range defenses, radar spinning at full tilt. By 4, a Hamas drone skims the waves. CIWS cannons ignite, shredding it into the sea spray. At 4:15 p.m., CAESR guns unleash guided rounds into Beit Hanun, detonations echoing through 3 layers of crumbling walls. In a dim workshop, militants strip batteries from ruined drones, sparks glinting across soot-stained hands. A Reaper drone locates the original command node, its Hellfire strike captured frame by frame in the haze. In Tel Aviv, an operations chief exhales into the headset, tighten the ring one last time. By 5:55, the control grid turns stable, dusk falling through drifting smoke. At 6 p.m., the fading sun cuts through white smoke as an MQ-9's shadow stretches across collapsed rooftops, its engines humming in stubborn rhythm. In Khan Yunis, an old woman drags a broken suitcase past walls blackened by fire, glass crunching beneath her steps. A Heron drone descends, capturing the ruins in a flicker of red light. Inside an IDF control room, soldiers stare at blank coordinates, hands frozen on headsets. Beyond the border, an American officer rinses his face, rifle still resting on his shoulder. At 6:15 p.m., artillery falls silent, barrels still smoking beneath the unit's drooping flag. On a destroyer's deck, a technician wipes soot from a tomahawk tube, paint flaking along the seams. From Tel Al-Hawaz Ridge, a lone Israeli soldier scans the horizon through his scope. Nothing moves. In the U.S. command room, green signals spread across Gaza's map as generals sign in silence, their faces lit by fading screens. At 6:30 p.m., in a half-burned house, a clock hangs broken, yet its bell still sways with the wind. In the UAV station, operators remove their headsets slowly, black marks pressed into their palms. A young woman films the shattered streets on her cracked phone, her breath trembling behind the lens. By 6:45, the last drone lifts from Gaza, its shadow gliding over silent fields. At the UN, an advisor folds the final satellite image, his hand lingering on one red dot that no longer glows. At 6:50 p.m., security cameras flicker back on over Rafah, frames washed in soot, no one moving, only a bicycle lying amid the flames. A war correspondent exhales, typing the headline for the final report, the laptop's cold light reflecting in dust-streaked eyes. By 7, lights fade inside the U.S. command post, printers halting mid-page as officers drift into silence. In the international chamber, an empty chair bears the name Gaza, the bottle beside it unopened. At 7:30, the front grows still, only wind and dim fire remain awake.